The border station was already dark when Tesserin arrived, and the cartographer who had maintained it for 11 years was already gone. Not dead, not transferred, gone in the way that certain words acquire weight in the official record, their meaning deepened by the absence of explanation. The Concord's Bureau of Navigational Continuity had sent Tesserin to replace him, and the transfer order contained exactly one sentence that mattered. Occupant Dreven Hale, senior cartographer, has been removed from the active register. No recovery is expected. Assume post immediately. No recovery, not no return. Recovery as though what had happened to Dreven Hale was something the body suffers, not something a person does. Tesserin read the sentence twice on the transport shuttle, then folded the order into the breast pocket of her survey coat and did not look at it again. She was 53 years old, a Velshi tall, narrow-shouldered. Her species' four-fingered hands evolved for the precise manipulation of instruments and the patient tracing of lines on charts that spanned sectors. She had spent 22 years updating boundary designations along the Concord's outer trade corridors, where the work was routine and the borders moved only when empires did. She was not a frontier cartographer. She had not requested this post. But she was the only one who had not refused it. The Bureau had offered the position to 6 cartographers before her. Each had declined. 2 had cited health. 1 had cited family. 3 had returned the offer without explanation, their refusals logged as single-word entries. No, no, declined. Tesserin had been the 7th name on the list, and she suspected the list did not extend to an 8th. Her supervisor at the outer corridor's office, a Pellinari named Drusk who had overseen her work for 9 years and who had never once offered her an assignment she had not earned, had called her into his chamber when the Bureau's offer arrived. He had not said congratulations. He had said, "You understand that the last 3 occupants of that post left under sealed circumstances." It was not a question. Tesserin had said, "I understand that someone has to go." Drusk had looked at her for a long time, his 8-pupilled eyes cycling through focus adjustments the way Pellinari eyes did when processing information they found troubling, and then he had signed her transfer authorization without another word. The station was called Venmark 9. It occupied a gravitational shelf at the very edge of what the Concord's charts designated as navigable space, the last point where the standard galactic coordinate system still applied before the grid dissolved into the region the Concord had agreed 4 centuries ago to stop mapping. The station was small, a central operations module with a reinforced viewport overlooking the border, a living quarters module attached by a pressurized corridor, a communications array that could reach the nearest Concord relay in 14 hours, and a cartographic suite containing the instruments and archives that were the entire purpose of the post. The border itself was not a wall. It was not a minefield or an energy barrier or a patrolled frontier. It was a line on a chart, a navigational designation that existed because every species in the Concord had agreed, independently and without coordination, that the space beyond it should not be entered. The agreement predated the Concord. It predated most of the species that now honored it. The line had been drawn by cartographers who were dead before Tesserin's species had developed written language, and in all the centuries since, the only amendment had been to move it further back. The Velshi had a word for borders like this one. Chevroni, a line that marks not where one territory ends and another begins, but where knowledge itself stops, where the instruments fail and the charts go blank, and the discipline that produced them has nothing further to offer. Tesserin's instructors at the Velshi Cartographic Institute had used the word sparingly, the way medical instructors use the word terminal not to frighten, but to establish respect for a category of problem that proficiency alone could not solve. Tesserin docked at 300 station time. The airlock cycled with the slow reluctance of systems that had been running without maintenance, and the air that met her when the inner seal opened carried the stale sweetness of recycled atmosphere that had been breathing only one set of lungs for too long. She moved through the living quarters first. The cot was made with a precision that suggested habit rather than care. The corners folded identically, the single pillow centered, the thin thermal blanket drawn taut. The personal effects had been removed by the bureau, she assumed, not by Hale himself. The galley unit was clean. A single cup sat in the drying rack, positioned handle outward, the orientation of someone who expected to reach for it again. Everything had the sterile quality of a space that had been emptied of personality, but not of presence. In the corridor between the galley and the main module, she found the first anomaly. A scratch on the deck plating a single line, straight and deliberate, scored into the metal with something harder than standard-issue tools. It ran from the left wall to the right wall, perfectly perpendicular to the corridor's long axis. She knelt and examined it. The scratch was clean, not old, not the result of equipment being dragged or furniture shifted. Someone had carved a line across the floor of the station, and the line corresponded, when she checked it against the station's internal coordinate grid, to the bearing of the border itself. As though Hale had wanted to mark, physically, on the floor of his home, the direction from which the thing he watched was coming. She stood up and continued to the cartographic suite. The suite was different from the rest of the station. She found it at the end of the main corridor, behind a pressure door that opened when she pressed her bureau credentials to the panel. The room was circular, dominated by a central projection table that displayed a three-dimensional rendering of the local sector in pale blue light. The rendering was current, updated within the last 72 hours, based on the timestamp in the corner of the display. Hale had still been maintaining the charts when whatever happened to him happened. The walls were covered with secondary displays, each showing a different data feed: long-range sensor returns, gravitational anomaly tracking, subspace communication intercepts from the border region. 7 of the 12 displays were active. The other 5 were dark, not powered down, but displaying nothing, their feeds terminated at the source. Tessavrin checked the logs. Each of the 5 dead feeds corresponded to a sensor relay that had been positioned inside the border zone itself. Instruments placed there decades ago to monitor conditions in the space the Concord had chosen not to chart. All 5 had gone offline within the last 3 years. No malfunction reports, no debris signatures. They had simply stopped transmitting, one by one, at intervals that Tessavrin calculated as roughly 7 months apart. She noted this. She did not yet understand it. A 6th relay, designated RB06, was still active. Its signal was weak, degraded by distance and interference, barely above the noise floor, but it was transmitting. Tessavrin tuned the receiver and pulled the feed onto the main display. The data was routine: radiation levels, magnetic field measurements, particle density, all within normal parameters for deep space vacuum. Except for one reading that the relay's diagnostic system had flagged with a yellow caution marker. The ambient temperature in the relay's immediate vicinity was 0.7 degrees above the expected baseline for its position. Not much. Barely outside the margin of instrument error. But the reading had been consistent for the last 43 days without variation, and the relay's thermal model could not account for the source of the warmth. The projection table held the chart, the one this station existed to maintain. It showed the border in exacting detail, a curved line rendered in amber light that traced the boundary between the Concord's navigable grid and the space beyond. On the Concord side, the chart was dense with data star systems cataloged and cross-referenced, trade routes marked, gravitational hazards flagged, navigation beacons plotted. On the other side of the amber line, the chart was empty. Not blank in the way of unexplored space, which was typically rendered in gray to indicate unknown conditions. Empty rendered in true black, the same black the projection table used for the void between galaxies, a deliberate visual choice. The space beyond the border was not unknown. It was refused. Tessavrin spent her first 3 days establishing routine. She calibrated the remaining sensor arrays. She verified the communication link to the Concord relay. She ran diagnostic checks on the station's power systems, life support, and navigational equipment. She cataloged the contents of the supply locker and confirmed that the Bureau had provisioned the station for a standard 18-month rotation. The number told her something not about their confidence in her tenure, but about the budgetary cycle that governed resupply missions to posts this remote. 18 months was the interval between freight runs. Whether the cartographer lasted that long was a separate question. She reviewed the station's operating manual, which was thorough and unremarkable except for a single page near the back, handwritten in a script she recognized as Drathani Hale's species. The page was not part of the original manual. It had been added, slipped between the final printed page and the back cover, folded once. The page contained no instructions. It contained a single sentence, written in the careful hand of someone who had taken time with each letter. The border is not where the chart says it is. She read the sentence. She set the manual down. She returned to the cartographic suite and pulled up the border's positional data for the last 11 years, the full span of Hale's tenure. The data told a story that the Bureau's transfer order had not. The border had moved. Not dramatically, not in the sudden catastrophic way that borders move during wars or gravitational events. The amber line on the chart had shifted inward toward Concord space by 0.003 parsecs per standard year, a distance so small that it would take a millennium to consume a single star system. A distance so small that the automated monitoring systems did not flag it, because the variance fell within the tolerance threshold that had been set centuries ago by cartographers who assumed the border was static. Hale had noticed. The handwritten annotation proved it. Tessavrin dug deeper into his records and found a series of personal log entries stored in a secondary partition of the station's data core, outside the Bureau's standard reporting architecture. The partition was encrypted, but the encryption key was stored in the margin of the manual page, written in Drathani numerals so small that Tessavrin had to hold the paper under the cartographic suite's magnification lamp to read them. Hale had wanted his successor to find these records. He had just not wanted the Bureau to find them first. There were 37 entries spanning 7 years. Tessavrin read them all. She read them in the blue light of the projection table, in the silence of a station that had been listening to the border for over a decade, and by the time she finished, the silence had changed. The first entry was dated 6 years and 11 months before her arrival. Positional variance confirmed. The border has shifted inward by 0.019 parsecs since my arrival. I have verified this against 3 independent reference points. The shift is consistent and directional. The border is advancing toward Concord space along a broad front approximately 40 light-years wide. I have not reported this because I do not yet understand the mechanism, and I am unwilling to issue a finding I cannot explain. The Bureau will want an explanation. I do not have one. The second entry 4 months later. The shift continues. 0.022 parsecs total. I have attempted to correlate the advance with any known astrophysical phenomenon: stellar drift, gravitational lensing, dark matter density fluctuation. None account for the pattern. The advance is too uniform, too directional. Natural processes do not produce straight-line boundary shifts across a 40 light-year front. Something is pushing. The third entry, 9 months after the second, was longer. The tone shifted from clinical observation to something approaching unease. I sent a calibration probe to verify the border's position directly. The probe crossed the amber line at 1440 station time. Telemetry remained nominal for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. At minute 4 and 12 seconds, the probe's navigational computer reported a coordinate mismatch. It believed it was 0.04 parsecs further from the border than its actual position. At minute 4 and 30 seconds, the mismatch widened to 0.1 parsecs. At minute 5, the probe reported that it could not determine its position at all. Its coordinate system had become meaningless. The probe continued to transmit for another 17 minutes, but the telemetry it sent was internally contradictory distance readings that decreased, while velocity remained constant, bearing calculations that placed the probe simultaneously at 3 different points. A gravitational reading that suggested the probe was near a stellar mass that does not exist on any chart. At minute 22, the transmission ceased. No termination signal, no debris signature. The probe did not explode or malfunction. It simply stopped being in a place where signals could leave. Tessavrin read the entry 3 times. She was aware that her hands had stopped moving over the console, that the stillness in the room had acquired the quality of held breath. The cartographic suite's ventilation system hummed at its steady pitch, and the pale blue light of the projection table painted her face in the colors of deep water. She opened the next entry, and the next, and the next. Hale had sent 9 probes over the following 3 years. Each crossed the border. Each reported the same sequence: nominal telemetry, coordinate mismatch, positional dissolution, silence. The timeline compressed with each successive probe. The first had lasted 22 minutes, the second 19, the third 15. By the 7th, dissolution occurred in under 9 minutes. The 8th lasted 7. The 9th, the last one Hale logged before the entries began to change, lasted 6 minutes and 14 seconds. The border was not just moving. It was becoming more efficient. Between probes, Hale had also been tracking the 5 sensor relays that would eventually go dark. His records were meticulous. Relay RB02 had been the first to fail, 3 years and 7 months before Tessavrin's arrival. Its final transmissions, which Hale had captured and stored in full, showed a pattern that mirrored the probe data. Nominal readings for 71 days after the border's latest advance brought it within 0.004 parsecs of the relay's position. Then a slow onset of contradictory measurements, temperature readings oscillating between values that differed by a factor of 10, magnetic field vectors pointing in directions that did not correspond to any source in the relay's detection range, and then silence. Not a shutdown. Not a power failure. The relay's last transmission was a routine status ping, perfectly formatted, arriving at the expected interval containing data that appeared normal in every respect except that the relay's reported position was 1.2 parsecs from where it should have been, as though the space around it had quietly rearranged itself without informing the instrument inside. Relay RB05 had been the second, then RB07, then RB04, then RB08. Each failure followed the same pattern. The border advanced, the relay's readings went strange, and then the relay stopped being in a place that could send signals. The intervals were consistent 7 months, give or take a week. Tessavrin did the arithmetic. At the current rate of advance and the current spacing of the remaining relays, RB06, the one still transmitting, the one running warm would be next. She estimated its silence within 14 months. She also found something Hale had not mentioned in the main log entries: a set of spectral analyses, stored separately, each labeled with a date and a bearing. He had been taking light readings from the stars beyond the border, measuring their spectral signatures through the station's optical array, and comparing them to the Concord stellar catalogs. The stars were real. Their hydrogen lines were where they should be, their luminosity classes correct, their positions consistent with galactic models. But the readings had an anomaly that Hale had underlined 3 times in red. The spectral noise floor was decreasing. Over 11 years, the background interference in the light from beyond the border, the random scatter caused by interstellar dust, magnetic turbulence, and the 1,000 small impurities that make starlight complex, had dropped by 23%. The stars were getting cleaner. Year by year, their light was losing the noise that proved it had traveled through anything at all. Hale had graphed the decline. The curve was smooth, not exponential, not logarithmic, linear. A straight line, steady and patient, as though someone were slowly, methodically cleaning a window, not by removing the glass, but by removing the concept of obstruction from the space the light passed through. Tesserin stared at the graph for a very long time. She understood now what the noiseless starlight meant in terms she could not have articulated to the Bureau, because the Bureau's vocabulary did not contain the necessary words. The void beyond the border was not being emptied. It was being unified. Whatever occupied that space was replacing the normal chaos of the interstellar medium. The dust, the radiation, the particle winds, the gravitational eddies, the million separate things that make space a collection of distinct phenomena with something singular, something continuous, something that had no internal boundaries because it was, in some sense that the instruments could measure but not explain, all one thing. And that one thing was warm, and its rhythm was human, and it was growing. Tesserin sat with this for a long time. The station creaked around her, the small sounds of metal adjusting to thermal cycling, the distant hum of the power plant, the faint tick of the sensor array rotating on its mount outside the hull. She was a cartographer. Her entire professional life had been the discipline of recording what was there and marking what was not. The border was the largest absence on the Concord's charts, and it was growing. She should have reported it. The protocol was clear. Any boundary anomaly exceeding 0.001 parsecs required immediate notification to the Bureau. Hale's documented shift was 20 times that threshold. Tesserin pulled up the communication console, composed the first 3 sentences of a formal variance report, and stopped. She stopped because she understood in that moment why Hale had not reported it either. The Bureau would send a committee. The committee would spend 6 months forming a subcommittee. The subcommittee would requisition a survey vessel. The survey vessel would send probes. The probes would cross the border and dissolve, exactly as Hale's had, and the committee would write a report concluding that further study was needed. The report would be classified. The classification would be cited as grounds for reducing the committee's budget. The border would continue to move, and the next cartographer assigned to this station would find the same data and face the same choice: report and be processed by a bureaucracy that had been designed, over 4 centuries, to manage the border's existence without ever confronting its nature. Hale had chosen to understand instead. Tesserin suspected that choice was what had consumed him. She returned to his logs. The later entries changed. The careful analytical prose of the early years gave way to something more fragmented, shorter sentences, longer gaps between entries, the occasional phrase repeated as though the writer had forgotten he had already used it, or as though he needed to say it again, because saying it once had not been enough to make it real. The border is not a boundary, it is an edge. I can hear the sensor array at night. The pitch changes when the border shifts, a quarter tone drop, consistent. The 6th relay went offline today. RB03, 7 months since the last one. I did not file a maintenance report. There is nothing to maintain. The relay is not broken. The relay is somewhere else now. Sent probe 10 today. 6 minutes to dissolution. The telemetry in the final 30 seconds included a single readable data point, a temperature reading. The temperature was consistent with a human body. Tesserin stopped reading. She stared at the entry. The words were precise. A temperature reading consistent with a human body, not a star, not a reactor, not the residual thermal signature of a vessel or a weapon. A body, 37 degrees Celsius, or the narrow band around it that human physiology maintained. She pulled up the raw telemetry from probe 10. Hale had stored it separately, flagged with a code she did not recognize. The data confirmed his entry. In the final seconds before dissolution, the probe had registered a thermal source, a single point of warmth, in a region that the Concord's charts recorded as void. The temperature was 37.1 degrees Celsius. The reading had lasted 4 seconds before the probe's instruments failed. Tessavrin cross-referenced the reading against the anomalous temperature on relay RB06, the one still transmitting, the one running 0.7 degrees warm. Different instruments, different positions, different times, but the direction of the anomaly was the same. Warmer than the void should be. Warmer than anything should be in a region with no stars, no reactors, no energy sources of any kind. Something in the space the Concord refused to chart was generating warmth, and the warmth was consistent with the thermal output of human physiology. She understood now why 5 delegations had sent their placards face down at the last intercession review, why 6 cartographers had refused this post, why Hale's transfer order used the word recovery instead of return. The space beyond the border was not empty. It was not a void. It was not the aftermath of some ancient catastrophe that had rendered 41 systems uninhabitable. The border was a surface, the outermost edge of something that was alive, or had been alive, or had become alive in the way that certain processes become alive when they have been running long enough and complexly enough that the distinction between mechanism and organism ceases to matter. And it was warm, 37.1 degrees. The warmth of human hands. She continued through the logs. The final entries were sparse but devastating in their precision. I have plotted the border's position every day for 11 years. The shift is not accelerating. It is breathing. The advance is not constant, it pulses. A slow expansion, then a partial contraction, then a further expansion that exceeds the previous maximum. The cycle takes approximately 127 days. I have overlaid this cycle on every biological rhythm in the Concord's medical databases. It matches nothing except one. Human circadian drift, the slow desynchronization of the human body clock from external time cues when isolated from natural light. 127 days is the period at which a human circadian cycle, left unentrained, completes one full rotation relative to standard galactic time. Tessavrin felt the air in the cartographic suite change, not the temperature, not the pressure, something else, a quality she could not name, as though the room had begun to pay attention. The border is dreaming, Hale had written. That is the closest word I have. It advances when it sleeps and retreats when it wakes, and the rhythm is human because whatever is on the other side of that line was human once and is still keeping human time. The last entry was dated 3 days before the Bureau's removal order. The handwriting had changed, still legible, still controlled, but smaller. The letters leaned slightly forward, as though the hand that wrote them was being drawn toward the viewport. I went to the viewport this morning and looked at the border, not at the chart, at the space itself. The stars on the other side are still there, I can see them, but they look different now. The light from them is too steady, no scintillation, no atmospheric shimmer, no variation. Starlight should vary. It passes through dust, through magnetic fields, through the faint turbulence of the interstellar medium, and each passage introduces noise. The light from beyond the border has no noise. It is perfectly clean, as though it is not passing through anything to reach me, as though the space between those stars and my eyes has been replaced by something that conducts light without altering it, something continuous, something whole. I have been staring at perfect light for 11 years. I do not think I can look at imperfect light anymore and call it real. Tessavrin closed the log. She sat in the cartographic suite for a long time after that. The projection table cast its steady blue glow across the room, and the amber line of the border pulsed faintly on the chart, and the 5 dead sensor feeds stared from the wall like closed eyes. She thought about Drevin Hale, a cartographer like herself, trained in the same discipline, committed to the same principle: draw what is there. Map the world as it is, not as the Bureau says it should be. Hale had drawn what was there. The problem was that what was there had drawn him back. She stood. She walked the length of the station, through the pressurized corridor that connected the cartographic suite to the living quarters, past the galley and the maintenance panel and the secondary airlock, to the observation deck at the far end of the habitation module. This viewport was larger than the one in the cartographic suite, a full-width panel of reinforced composite glass that gave an unobstructed view of the border region. The view was extraordinary and terrible. On the left, Concord space, the familiar scatter of stars, their light flickering with the interference of distance and dust and the thousand small impediments that light accumulates on its way from source to eye. Normal, noisy, alive in the way that imperfect things are alive. On the right, beyond the invisible line, stars that burned with a clarity that made her eyes ache. No flicker, no noise, no dust, just light, clean and whole and absolute, as though the space it traveled through had been polished to a transparency that nature does not produce. The stars on the Concord side looked like candles seen through dirty glass. The stars beyond the border looked like what candles would look like if you removed the glass entirely, removed the air, removed the distance, removed everything between the flame and the eye until there was nothing left but the seeing. Tesserine pressed her four-fingered hand against the viewport. The glass was cold, colder than it should have been, not dangerously, not dramatically, but measurably, in the precise way that a cartographer's senses are trained to register. A degree below baseline, perhaps two. The cold concentrated where her fingertips touched, as though something on the other side was reading the warmth of her hand through the glass. She pulled her hand back. The cold faded. She put her hand back. The cold returned not from the glass cooling, but from something drawing warmth toward it through the glass, the way a body draws warmth from a blanket, not consuming it, not stealing it, incorporating it. She was a veilshi, a species that processed fear as stillness, the body's response not to flee but to become very, very quiet, as though silence might keep the predator's attention elsewhere. She was very quiet now. That evening, station evening, the arbitrary dimming of the lights that the station's environmental system imposed to simulate a day-night cycle for the benefit of occupants whose biology required one Tesserine, did something she had not planned. She walked to the maintenance panel in the corridor and pulled up the station's external hull temperature readings. The readings were logged automatically, updated every 6 hours, archived for 5 years. She scrolled back through the data. The station's hull temperature on the side facing the border was 0.4 degrees above the nominal baseline. It had been 0.4 degrees above baseline for the last 9 months. Before that, it had been 0.3 degrees. Before that, 0.2. She scrolled further. 5 years ago, the variance had been within the margin of instrument error, 0.05 degrees, insignificant, invisible. Hale had not mentioned it in his logs. Perhaps he had not checked. Or perhaps he had checked and had chosen not to record the finding, because recording it would have meant acknowledging that the thing he was watching was not just somewhere out there beyond the border. It was here. It was warming the hull of his home. It was touching the metal that separated his atmosphere from the void, and the metal was conducting the warmth inward, and every breath he had taken for the last 11 years had been heated, by a fraction of a degree, by the body he was mapping. Tesserine closed the maintenance panel. She stood in the corridor, the same corridor where Hale had scratched a line into the deck plating, the bearing of the border carved into the floor. She looked at the line. She looked at the wall that faced the border. She placed her four-fingered hand against the wall, palm flat, fingers spread. The metal was warm. Not hot. Not alarming, the warmth of a surface that had been in sunlight and was now in shade, residual, gentle, present. The kind of warmth you could explain away if you wanted to. The kind of warmth that required no explanation if you were willing to accept what the data said. Tesserine removed her hand. She went to the galley. She made a cup of the synthetic broth that the Bureau provisioned for veilshi personnel, and she sat at the small table where Hale's single cup had sat in the drying rack, and she drank the broth slowly, and she tried to think about anything other than the fact that the wall at her back was warm because the body that the galaxy called a forbidden zone was pressing against the outside of her station. The way, A sleeping animal presses against the wall of a room it does not know it is in. She failed. She thought about it for the rest of the night. On the fourth day, she sent her own probe. She had told herself she would wait 30 days. She had told herself the protocol required a systematic approach, verify the station's equipment, calibrate the instruments, establish a baseline. But the data from Hale's logs had settled into her mind the way sediment settles into water, and she could not see clearly through it until she confirmed the measurements herself. The probe was a standard Bureau survey unit, a cylinder the size of her forearm, equipped with navigational sensors, a thermal imager, a spectral analyzer, and a communications package rated for deep space transmission. She programmed its trajectory, double-checked the telemetry link, and launched it from the station's external bay at 900 station time. It crossed the amber line at 9:14. For the first 4 minutes the telemetry was clean, position nominal, velocity constant, thermal readings consistent with background vacuum. The probe's navigational computer reported its bearing and distance from the station, with the quiet confidence of a system that had never had reason to doubt its instruments. At minute 4 and 8 seconds, the first anomaly appeared. The probe's position fix stuttered a brief discrepancy between the inertial navigation reading and the signal triangulation reading, as though the probe were simultaneously in two places separated by 0.02 parsecs. The discrepancy lasted less than a second, then resolved. Tessavrin noted it. At minute 4 and 22 seconds, the discrepancy returned. This time it did not resolve. The inertial system placed the probe 0.04 parsecs from the border. The signal triangulation placed it 0.09 parsecs. The difference was widening. At minute 4 and 40 seconds, the probe's thermal imager registered something. A gradient. Not the sharp boundary of a heat source, not a star or an engine or a reactor. A gradient, diffuse and uniform, as though the space itself were slightly warmer than the instruments expected. The temperature at the probe's position had risen by 0.3 degrees. By minute 5, it was 0.8 degrees above baseline. By minute 5 and 30 seconds, 1.4 degrees. Tessavrin watched the numbers climb. She felt her four-fingered hands flatten against the console's surface, the veil-she stillness response, the body's attempt to make itself small and quiet. At minute 6, the probe's navigational computer reported that it could not determine its position. All three reference systems, inertial, signal triangulation, and stellar fix, were returning different results, and the differences were not random. They were diverging in a pattern, as though the space around the probe were stretching in one direction and compressing in another, like the surface of something breathing. At minute 6 and 30 seconds, the temperature read 4.1 degrees above baseline. At minute 7, the spectral analyzer returned its first result. The probe was measuring the light from a star that should have been 2.3 light-years away. The spectral signature matched perfectly, but the noise floor in the measurement was 0. Not low, 0. The light had no interference. It had not passed through anything to reach the probe's detector. There was nothing between the star and the probe, except the continuous, warm, unified medium that the border zone had become. At minute 7 and 22 seconds, the temperature read 12.7 degrees above baseline. The thermal imager showed no point source. The heat was everywhere, ambient, as though the probe were floating inside something alive. At minute 7 and 41 seconds, the probe's communication signal began to degrade. Not from distance, from something interfering with the signal itself, not blocking it but absorbing it, the way warm water absorbs the vibration of a tuning fork placed on its surface. At minute 8, the temperature read 29.4 degrees. At minute 8 and 19 seconds, 34.1. At minute 8 and 30 seconds, 36.8. At minute 8 and 37 seconds, the probe transmitted its final readable data point. Temperature, 37.2 degrees Celsius. Then the signal smoothed into a carrier wave with no data, as though the probe's instruments had not stopped working but had simply run out of things to measure that were separate from the medium surrounding them. And then silence. 5 minutes and 23 seconds, faster than Hale's last probe by 41 seconds. The border was still learning. Tesserin sat in the cartographic suite and did not move for a very long time. The temperature graph from the probe's final transmission glowed on the display, the curve rising smoothly from baseline to 37.2 degrees, the same narrow band that human physiology maintained, the same warmth that Hale had found in probe 10, the same anomalous reading on relay RB06. Not a heat source, not an energy signature, a temperature, body temperature, the temperature of the inside of something alive. The probe had not been destroyed. The probe had been enveloped. She added the data to Hale's chart in the secondary partition. Probe 11, 5 minutes 23 seconds to incorporation. Temperature at dissolution, 37.2 degrees Celsius. She drew the trajectory, marked the termination point, updated the efficiency graph. The line continued its smooth descent. She calculated. At the current rate of acceleration, a probe launched a year from now would last approximately 3 minutes. 2 years from now, 90 seconds. The border was growing faster at its consumption, even as its expansion rate remained steady. Growing more efficient at absorbing, while maintaining the same slow, breathing advance. As though the body were not hungry, but simply more practiced at digesting. She stood at the viewport for 11 minutes. She counted each one, the way a cartographer counts measurements precisely, because precision is the only defense against the moment when the data becomes something you feel instead of something you record. Then she returned to the cartographic suite and did what no cartographer in the Concord's 400-year history of this post had done. She updated the chart. Not the official chart, the Bureau's sanctioned rendering that showed the border as a static amber line. She opened a personal workspace within the projection table's secondary partition, the same partition where Hale had stored his logs, and she began to draw. She drew the border where it actually was 0.033 parsecs closer to Concord space than the official chart showed. She drew the advance rate, the slow breathing rhythm that Hale had documented, rendered as a pulsing amber band rather than a fixed line, its oscillation visible as a gentle tidal motion. She drew the 5 dead sensor relays, marking each with the date of its last transmission and the interval between failures. She drew the thermal anomaly from probe 10, a single warm point in the void, 37.1 degrees, marked with a symbol she invented for the occasion. A small circle with a line through it, the cartographic convention for a feature that exists but cannot be classified. She drew the noiseless zone, the region where starlight lost its natural variation and became clean. She rendered it as a gradient, fading from the normal noise of Concord space through a transition band and into the perfect clarity beyond. The gradient was beautiful on the chart. She noted this and did not delete it. She drew the probe trajectory's 9 lines extending from the station's position into the void, each terminating at the point where telemetry had ceased. She marked the termination points with timestamps. Probe 1, 22 minutes. Probe 9, 6 minutes and 14 seconds. The compression was visible. The border was learning to dissolve what crossed it. She drew the circadian overlay, the 127-day breathing cycle that Hale had identified, rendered as a sine wave superimposed on the border's edge. The wave's amplitude was tiny, a few thousandths of a parsec, but its regularity was absolute, not the jagged irregularity of a natural process, the smooth, living rhythm of a body at rest. She worked for 14 hours. When she finished, the chart in the personal workspace looked nothing like the Bureau's official rendering. The official chart showed a dead zone, a flat black absence bordered by an amber wall. Tessevrin's chart showed something alive. The border pulsed. The dead relays marked a pattern of advancing incorporation. The thermal point glowed in the void like a heartbeat rendered visible. She saved the chart. She encrypted it with her personal credentials and hails a dual lock that would require both cartographers' authorization to open, ensuring that the Bureau could not access it without acknowledging that Hale's work existed. On the seventh day, Relay RB06 went silent. Tesavrin had estimated 14 months. It took 7 days. The border had accelerated, not its expansion, which continued at the same breathing pace Hale had documented, but its reach. The zone of influence around the border's edge, the region where instruments began to fail and signals began to blur, had extended further into Concord space than any of Hale's measurements predicted. She had been monitoring the relay's feed in real time when it happened. The temperature reading, which had been steady at 0.7 degrees above baseline for 43 days, began to climb, slowly, 1/10 of a degree per hour, then 1/10 per minute, then faster. The magnetic field readings went incoherent, first vectors spinning, magnitudes oscillating between values that made no physical sense. The radiation readings followed. Then the position fix, which reported the relay at 4 different locations simultaneously before returning a null value. The last datum the relay transmitted was a temperature, 36.9 degrees Celsius. Then the carrier wave flattened to silence. All 6 border relays were now dark. The only instruments the Concord had left inside the border zone were Tesavrin's station sensors, which were not inside the zone but facing it, and whatever the station's optical array could measure of the light from beyond. Tesavrin logged the failure. She updated the chart in the secondary partition. She drew a small circle where RB06 had been, with the date and the final temperature, and she connected the 6 dead relays with a dotted line that traced the advancing front of the incorporation zone. The dotted line was inside the official border. It was also inside the official border's tolerance threshold, which meant the automated systems would not flag it for another decade. By then, the incorporation zone would have consumed the first Concord navigation beacon on the nearest trade route, and the beacon would go dark the way the relays had gone dark, not destroyed, not broken, but absorbed into a context where the concept of a signal had been replaced by the concept of being. Tesavrin calculated the timeline. At the current rate, the first beacon in approximately 11 years, the second in 13. The first inhabited station in the border region, a fuel depot servicing freight haulers on the outer corridors, in approximately 47 years. Not her problem. Not in her lifetime. Not in anyone's lifetime at the current rate. The advance was glacial, patient. The pace of something that had no reason to hurry because it had no concept of time in the way that mortal species understood time. It breathed on a 127-day cycle, and each breath took it 0.003 parsecs further into the galaxy, and it had been doing this for 400 years, and it would keep doing it for 400 more and 400 after that. And the Concord's charts would keep showing the border as a static amber line, because the variance was within tolerance, and the committee would classify the report, and the subcommittee would reduce the budget, and the next cartographer would arrive and find the logs and face the same choice. And the border would keep breathing, and the body would keep growing, and the warmth 37.1 degrees, 37.2 degrees, 36.9 degrees, always the same narrow band, always the temperature of the inside of a living human body, would keep spreading through the void where the stars burned clean and the light had no noise, and the instruments dissolved because there was nothing left to measure that was separate from the measuring. Then she composed her first station report. It said nothing of the drift, nothing of the probes, nothing of the temperature reading or the circadian rhythm or the noiseless starlight. It said, Venmark 9 operations nominal, border position confirmed per official designation, sensor arrays calibrated, cartographer Tesavrin reporting for duty. She sent the report. She watched the communication array's transmission light pulse once, twice, 3 times as the signal propagated toward the Concord relay 14 hours away. Then she turned back to the viewport. The stars beyond the border shone steadily, perfectly, without noise. The 41 systems beyond the border had not been destroyed. They had not been conquered or evacuated or rendered lifeless. They had been absorbed. Whatever humanity had built or become or awakened in the centuries after first contact, whatever the Concord's oldest species had encountered and decided, in unanimous terror, to wall off and forget, had not stayed within its borders because it was contained. It had stayed because it was still forming, still growing, still drawing itself into a shape that the galaxy's instruments could not parse, because the instruments had been designed to measure objects, and this was not an object. It was a process, a becoming, and its outermost edge, the thing Tessavrin had been sent to map, was the growing rim of something that was turning the void between stars into an extension of itself, degree by degree, heartbeat by heartbeat, at the pace of a body breathing in its sleep. And the border was not a wall, the border was skin. Tessavrin was a cartographer. She understood lines. She understood that a line on a chart is a negotiation between what is known and what is not, a mark that says here is the edge of our confidence, here is where the data stops and the unknown begins. Every cartographer knows that the unknown is larger than the known, that every chart is an island of certainty in an ocean of what has not yet been measured. But this was different. This was not unmeasured space. This was space that had been measured and found to be something other than space, something that wore the shape of vacuum and starlight but was, beneath that shape, continuous, warm, and growing. The chart could show the border. The chart could show the drift. But the chart could not show what the border was the edge of, because what lay beyond the border was not a territory. It was not a region or a zone or a domain. It was a body. And Tessavrin was mapping its skin. She understood now the shape of Hale's 11 years, the slow accumulation of evidence, the careful, methodical documentation of something he could not stop and could not report, the decision to stay and watch, to record, to trace the contour of the unclassifiable with the only tools a cartographer possessed: patience, precision, and the willingness to draw what was there even when what was there could not be named. She understood why he had not reported the drift. It was not cowardice. It was not negligence. It was the cartographer's oldest instinct. Do not file the chart until the survey is complete. And this survey would never be complete because the thing being surveyed was still growing, still becoming, still drawing itself into a shape that had no precedent in the Concord's 400-year catalog of the galaxy's features. She understood why he was gone. The horror was not in the death. There was no death. That was the horror. Every species in the Concord had legends about the border tales of destruction, of annihilation, of fleets reduced to atoms and worlds scoured to bedrock. The legends were comfortable because they described an ending, and endings could be understood. Endings had shape. Endings could be warned against and mourned and memorialized in the cautionary language that civilizations used to teach their young what not to do. But incorporation was not an ending. It was a continuation. The fleets that crossed the border had not been destroyed, they had been included. The cartographers who vanished had not died, they had become part of the survey. The 41 systems were not gone. They were present, woven into the tissue of something vast that contained them the way a body contains the calcium of every meal it has ever eaten, not destroyed, not separate, but integrated beyond the possibility of retrieval. The Concord's legends were not warnings. They were misreadings. The galaxy had looked at the border and seen a graveyard, because a graveyard was something it knew how to process. It had not seen what the border actually was: a threshold, a membrane, the outermost surface of a living thing, because seeing that would require confronting a question no species in the Concord wanted to ask. What happens when the body finishes growing? Not what had happened to him, whether he had crossed the border voluntarily, whether the border had reached him, whether the distinction mattered. She understood the trajectory. 11 years of watching a living boundary advance. 11 years of listening to the sensor array's pitch drop a quarter tone each time the skin expanded. 11 years of standing at a viewport and seeing starlight too perfect to be natural, too beautiful to look away from, too steady to be anything but the glow of something vast looking back. Curiosity maintained long enough becomes proximity. Proximity maintained long enough becomes contact. And contact with the thing beyond the border was not the violent terminus the Concord's legends implied, not the fleet-destroying catastrophe, not the extinction event, not the cautionary tale of hubris meeting annihilation. It was something quieter, something worse. Incorporation. The border breathed, the body grew, and the cartographer, the one person in the Concord whose job was to stare at the edge and record what they saw, was the one person most likely to stand close enough, for long enough, to become part of what they were mapping. Tessavrin returned to the console. She opened a new log entry in Hale's partition, continuing the sequence he had started, adding her observations to his, extending the record. Station Day 1, she wrote. The border's current position is 0.033 parsecs inside the official designation. Advance rate consistent with predecessor's observations. Sensor relays 4 through 8 are offline. Relay 6 remains active but reports an unexplained thermal anomaly. The temperature reading from probe 10's final telemetry has not been independently verified. I intend to send an 11th probe within the first 30 days to confirm. She paused. The cursor blinked in the dim light. I understand now why cartographer Hale did not report the drift. I do not agree with his decision, but I understand it. The data is incomplete. The mechanism is unknown. The implications are beyond the Bureau's operational vocabulary. To report this finding would be to ask the Concord to confront something it has spent 4 centuries agreeing not to see. Another pause. The ventilation system cycled. The sensor array ticked through its rotation outside the hull. I will maintain the official chart as designated. I will maintain the secondary chart as cartographer Hale began it. I will continue the survey. The border is alive and it is advancing and it is warm, and the warmth is human, and I do not know what that means. But I know that someone must be here to record it when the Concord's instruments finally fail to measure it at all. She saved the entry. She locked the partition. Then she opened a new document, not a log entry, not a chart annotation. A formal communication, addressed to no one, saved to the same encrypted partition, intended for whatever cartographer came after her. To my successor, she wrote, you will find the official chart in order. You will also find a secondary chart, encrypted under my credentials and those of cartographer Hale, in partition 7 of the projection table's data core. The encryption key is in the station manual back page, written small. Open it, read the logs, verify the measurements, send your own probe. Then make your choice. File the chart, and let the Concord decide what to do with the knowledge that the border is alive and advancing, or stay, and continue the survey, and watch the amber line fall further behind the truth until the truth reaches the station. I do not recommend either option. I do not know which is right. I know only that someone must be here, at the edge, with instruments running and eyes open, recording what the Concord cannot bring itself to see. The border is warm, 37.1 degrees. The warmth of human hands. Whatever those hands are attached to now has been growing for 4 centuries and shows no sign of stopping, and the only reason the galaxy has not noticed is that it agreed not to look. I am looking. I will keep looking until I cannot. Cartographer Tessavrin, Venmark 9, Station Day 1. She saved the letter. She locked the partition. She checked the encryption twice, once for her key, once for Hale's. She stood. The station was quiet around her, the hum of the power plant, the tick of the sensor array, the faint creak of metal settling against the cold. The blue light of the projection table painted the walls in the colors of a world underwater. The amber line on the chart pulsed faintly, holding its position, holding its lie. She walked to the viewport one last time. She pressed both hands to the glass, all 8 fingers spread wide against the cold surface. The cold answered, the same slow, patient draw. The same vast curiosity that had been there when she arrived, and would be there when she was gone, and would be there when every cartographer the Bureau sent had been replaced, and the station itself had been swallowed by the advancing edge of something that the galaxy's oldest species had decided, 400 years ago, was easier to forget than to face. The 41 systems, the fleets that had crossed and not returned, the probes that dissolved, the sensor relays that went silent, the cartographers who vanished, every loss the official charts recorded as void, every absence the Concord's legends explained as destruction was not an ending. It was an addition. Each thing that crossed the border did not die. It was incorporated, added to the body, folded into the warm, dreaming mass that had once been human, and was now something the galaxy did not have a word for, because the galaxy had spent 4 centuries refusing to look closely enough to need one. Tessavrin looked. The stars beyond the border were beautiful. The stars beyond the border were perfect. They shone with a light that had no noise because nothing separated them from the eye anymore, no dust, no interference, no space in the way that space is normally understood. The void between those stars was not empty. It was full. It was tissue. It was the medium through which the body thought and dreamed and breathed. And the light that passed through it was not diminished because there was nothing left to diminish it, only the clean, continuous, living substance of whatever humanity had become. She removed her hands from the glass. The cold faded slowly, the glass warming back to baseline over the course of minutes, reluctantly, as though the connection had been mutual. She would stay, she would map. She would record the advance and the breathing rhythm and the temperature of the void, and she would watch the amber line on the official chart fall further behind the truth with each passing year, and she would not report it, not because she was afraid, but because there was no form in the Bureau's filing system for the sentence the data required. The border is not ours, the border is theirs, and theirs is not a territory. Theirs is a body, and we are living on its skin, and it is growing, and it does not know we are here, and that is the only reason we are still alive. The station creaked. The sensor array turned. The stars beyond the border held their impossible, noiseless light. Tessavrin began her watch.